In the autumn of 1999, a young man stood inside one of the most hostile football cathedrals in Europe, and the crowd that had spent decades intimidating every outsider who dared enter fell completely silent. He was not supposed to be there, not according to history, not according to anyone who thought they understood the game. Everything the football world believed about who could dominate European football, about where talent could come from, about what kind of man could survive the pressure of Serie A at its peak. He was about to prove all of it wrong. And nobody had seen it coming. It began in Fujisawa, a coastal city in Kanagawa Prefecture, where a boy was born in January of 1977 into a Japan that still saw football as something foreign, something borrowed, something that could never truly be its own. The sport barely existed in the national imagination, and yet something inside this boy was already speaking a language the world had not yet taught him. His father introduced him to the ball before he could fully understand what it meant, and from the first moment he touched it, something locked into place. While other children played and wandered, this boy stayed, practicing movements that had no name yet in the country he called home. Japan in the early 1980s had no professional football league, no structure, no pathway, no guarantee that a child who loved this game could ever build a life from it. The dreams that lived inside this boy had no map to follow, only the raw need to keep going. At school he was bookish and introverted, a boy who absorbed everything around him with unusual depth, languages, cultures, ideas that stretched far beyond the walls of his classroom. But football remained the one constant, the one space where the quiet boy became something else entirely. He joined Bellmare Hiratsuka as a teenager, and the Japanese football world was just beginning to wake from its long sleep. The J-League launched in 1993 like an explosion of color and noise, and suddenly this quiet boy from Fujisawa found himself standing at the edge of something enormous. He was gifted, everyone could see that, but the weight of what he carried went beyond talent. He was being shaped by a country that needed a symbol, and the pressure to represent something larger than himself began pressing down on his shoulders before he had even turned 20. By the time he reached Bellmare and began drawing serious attention, he was already thinking beyond Japan, scanning the horizon for something that had no precedent, something no Asian footballer had ever truly achieved in European football at its highest level. If you find yourself gripped by stories like this, consider following Football Untold, where every week we uncover the journeys that mainstream football forgot to tell. The 1998 World Cup in France became the stage where Japan first walked onto the global football map, and he walked with them. But the tournament ended in elimination, and the criticism that followed cut deep. Some questioned whether the dream was real at all. What the critics could not see was that failure had not broken him, it had clarified him. He left France knowing exactly where he needed to go next, and what he needed to prove, not to the world, but to himself. Perugia came calling from Serie A, and what happened next rewrote the definition of what was possible. Moving to Italy in 1998 meant entering a world that was not designed to welcome outsiders, a league of legends, of bruising defenders, of tactical chess played at a speed and intensity that had ended careers far more celebrated than his. Perugia was not a giant of Italian football. It was a small city club fighting to survive in the top division, and some saw the signing as a curiosity, a commercial experiment built on novelty rather than genuine belief. They were spectacularly wrong. Within months he had silenced every doubt. His technique was extraordinary, his vision almost unsettling in its precision, and his ability to read the game, to see what was coming before it arrived, made hardened Italian veterans look twice and then look again. He was named Serie A Player of the Year in his debut season. Not Player of the Month. Player of the Year. In a league that housed Ronaldo, Zidane, and the most talented footballers the world had ever gathered in one place, a 22-year-old from Fujisawa had outshone them all. The numbers told part of the story, but it was what he represented that truly shook the football world. For the first time in history, a player from Asia had not merely survived European football at the elite level, he had dominated it. The move to Roma in 2000 brought him to one of the great clubs of world football, and there he found something he had never quite had before, a team capable of competing for everything. In 2001, Roma won the Serie A title, and he was at its beating heart. Rome celebrated as it only knows how, in the streets, in the piazzas, in noise that lasted through the night. And somewhere in the middle of it all was a quiet man from Japan who had climbed the highest mountain in club football and stood at the top without losing himself. 2002 brought the World Cup to Japan and South Korea, and with it came an expectation that bordered on national hysteria. Every Japanese person who had ever loved football was watching, and they were watching him. Japan reached the round of 16 for the first time in history, and he delivered performances that the country would talk about for generations. The world was watching Asia differently now, because of one man who had refused to accept the limits others had drawn for him. He moved to Parma, then Bologna, then Fiorentina, continuing to perform at the highest level, continuing to build a career that had no precedent in the history of Asian football. Other clubs across Europe began scouting the continent he came from with new seriousness. Off the pitch he was becoming something even larger than a footballer. He moved through the worlds of fashion, culture, and global lifestyle with an ease that confused people who could only understand athletes as athletes. He was building something that football alone could not contain. He was becoming a bridge between cultures, between continents, between the world of sport and the world of ideas. Japanese fans idolized him not just as a player but as proof of something they had been told was impossible, that their voice belonged in the rooms where global culture was made. Bolton Wanderers brought him to England in 2006, a late chapter that surprised many, but even there he performed with the quiet professionalism that had defined every stage of his journey. He was never only passing through. He was always present, always purposeful. But the World Cup of 2006 in Germany brought the heaviest weight he had ever carried. Japan were eliminated at the group stage, and what followed was a silence that spoke more than any press conference. He had given everything, and still it had not been enough. In the summer of 2006, at 29 years old, with offers on the table and his body still capable of competing at the highest level, he walked away from professional football. No dramatic announcement, no farewell tour, just a quiet exit from a stage he had dominated for a decade. The football world scrambled to understand. Why now? Why at 29? Why walk away from money, from fame, from the game that had given him everything? The answer was already there for those who had truly been paying attention. He had always been playing for something beyond the game itself. He traveled the world after retirement, not as a celebrity, but as a learner. He visited over 50 countries, lived among communities in Africa, South America, and Asia, and dedicated himself to humanitarian work and cultural exchange. Football had been the vehicle. This was the destination. The generation of Asian footballers who came after him, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the players from across the continent who began finding homes in the Premier League, in La Liga, in Serie A. All of them walked through a door that he had opened alone. His story was never just about goals or titles or medals. It was about what happens when one person refuses to accept the world as it is and decides instead to show it what it could become. That is a kind of courage that has no position on a football pitch. And so the quiet boy from Fujisawa who was never supposed to matter to European football became the man who changed its future forever. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the relentless and patient force of someone who always knew exactly who he was. If this story moved you, follow Football Untold, because every week we find the players, the clubs, and the moments that history almost forgot to keep.